Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Amateur Radio General Class, session number 23. During our previous session, we had our usual question pool review. We discussed the NEC, or the National Electrical Code. We went into what AWG was. We discussed the current rating. We also talked about fuses and circuit breakers. We also dealt with the GFCI, or ground fault circuit interrupter. We also explored interlock switches. We discussed emergency generators and considerations. We also talked about the safety aspects of solder. Then we went into frequency privileges, in particular the 10-meter band, the 30-meter band, the 60-meter band. We also discussed frequency allocation, and we also talked about antenna structure limitations, and we ended with discussion on beacon stations. So when we look at our curriculum, we are seeing that we have progressed quite nicely. We are actually on the last section of the course, that's Commission's Rules. Just a reminder for persons to consider taking the practice exams. We are almost finished with the course, so there's no reason why you cannot attempt some of those practice tests and see how you're doing, and I'm sure you will probably be quite surprised how well you will actually do when you take these practice tests. So give it a shot. We had no outstanding questions from the last session, and we will now proceed to go into our usual question pool review in relation to the questions that have to do with the theories that we discussed last session. So we refer straight to our trustee no-nonsense general class license study guide. Okay, so that should be up on your screen now. And for persons who are following along in the PDF version of the text, we are on page 85. Okay, so let's go straight into the questions as we dealt with all of these theories the last session. So we'll go through as quickly as we can, just to show you what the actual questions look like and what the correct answer is. None of this should look unfamiliar to you. All right, let's go. First question in the question pool for this evening. Which of the following is covered by the National Electrical Code, or the NEC? And we said that's the book, the text that gives us electrical safety inside the ham shack. Okay, next question in the question pool. According to the National Electrical Code, or NEC, what is the minimum wire size that may be used safely for wiring with a 20 ampere circuit breaker? So let's dissect this question a little bit. What are they asking us? They're asking us, what is the minimum wire size? So as we learned last class, so we're doing American exams, so we measure wire in sizes according to AWG, American Wire Gauge. So therefore the answer will be AWG with some number. So what is the minimum wire size that will be used safely for wiring with a 20 amp circuit breaker? So we learned the last class that for 20 amp, we need to have a 12 gauge, or AWG number 12 for 20 amperes. Next one, similar question. Which size of fuse or circuit breaker would be appropriate to use with a circuit that uses AWG number 14 wiring? So they have just given us a sort of opposite way of asking a similar question. And they are telling us now they want to know what size of fuse or circuit breaker. So the answer will be fuses and circuit breakers are given in amperes. That's the current handling capacity of those protection devices. So the answer will be in amperes or amps. But they're asking us about 14 gauge wiring, or AWG number 14. And we had a little rule of thumb how we remember that. Remember, we said 14, 15, right? So for 14 gauge wiring, 15 amperes would be the size of the circuit breaker or the rating of the fuse. Next question, the question pool. Which wire or wires in a 4-conductor connection should be attached to fuses or circuit breakers in a device operated from 240 volts AC single-phase source? Okay, so a little bit long-winded question here. Let's dissect it and see what they're asking us about. So they're asking us about which wire or wires. So that's what the answer, the form of the answer will be which wire or wires. But in a 4-conductor connection. So therefore, we have 4 individual wires, 4 conductors. And we want to know which of these 4 should be attached to what? Fuses or circuit breakers. So last class, we showed a diagram to show that neutral and ground are never fused or connected to circuit breakers. They go direct. However, we showed that the other wires, the live wires that carry voltage, are the ones we put fuses on. And they're just telling us it's a 240 volt AC single phase source. So that means they are 2-line wires. So therefore, that's the answer. We put fuses or circuit breakers on only the 2 wires carrying the voltage. Very important to note, we never fuse a ground connection or a neutral. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following conditions will cause a ground fault circuit interrupter or GFCI to disconnect to disconnect the 120 or 240 volt AC line power to a device? All right, so what are they really asking us here? So they're asking us about the conditions. So what conditions must exist that will cause a GFCI? So we looked at what a GFCI was last session. We looked into the details of it. We also dealt with GFCIs during the technician level as well. But what will cause that to trip? That's what they're asking us, or disconnect the 120 or 240 volt AC line power. What will cause a GFCI to trip? And we had said that a GFCI is very important for safety, especially around wet areas in a house or a building. And the condition is current flowing from one or more of the voltage carrying wires directly to ground. So that's, for example, if someone were to touch the live wire and they're getting electrocuted, that current is not returning via the neutral. And the GFCI will detect that here's what, it's seeing a certain amount of current coming through the live, but it's not returning via the neutral. And it knows that that's a ground fault and it will trip. So that could be someone that is actually getting electrocuted, or a fault that is occurring, causing a fire, and it will actually trip that circuit. Okay, next question in the question pool. And just by the way, around your house, you're supposed to have GFCIs around kitchen counters, or if you have any, let's say, shavers or hair dryers in a bathroom, anywhere there's water nearby, a sink, a tap, you should have a GFCI outlet. The outlet itself may not be the GFCI outlet. You may have a GFCI breaker in the panel, or you can have one GFCI receptacle outlet protecting several regular outlets. So just note though, you need to have those as protection for yourself and your family and the household. Next question. What is the purpose of a power supply interlock? So we discussed that. We showed what an interlock device actually looked like last class. And the purpose is to ensure that dangerous voltages are removed if the cabinet is open. So you open a power supply and you don't want to stick your finger in, or a screwdriver or some other metallic object in there, and you get zapped because you did not unplug it. So the interlock will actually remove that dangerous supply for you automatically for the power supplies that have that feature. Of course, not all of them do. Many don't. But if you have that feature, that's great. Next question in the question pool. What must you do when powering your home? I say again, what must you do when powering your house from an emergency generator? So this is a safety question, and we need to disconnect the incoming utility power feed. You cannot have the incoming utility power feed in Trinidad and Tobago. That will be from T&Tech or whatever jurisdiction you are, Lucilec or Flower Power and Light, or whatever your supplier is. You need to make sure that's disconnected, because you cannot have that connected the same time as your trusty generator. It's a very unsafe could cause damage, could cause harm. All right, so next question in the question pool. Which of the following is true of an emergency generator installation? Again, another safety-related question. The generator should be located in a well-ventilated area. Remember we said that you have maybe gasoline that's powering your generator. In some cases, people use diesel generators. They may use propane, different types of generators. And you have exhaust as well. So you don't want that to be inside of the house. You certainly would want that to be in a well-ventilated area, possibly outside or away from where people live or stay. And the next question, related. Which of the following is a primary reason for not placing a gasoline-fueled generator inside an occupied area? So we just kind of talked around it. It is unsafe to do so, but the reason is you have the danger of carbon monoxide poisoning. So that's the reason why you don't put it inside where people are located or any living thing. Yeah. All right. Which of the following is a danger from lead tin solder? So we did say that lead can cause harm and contaminate food stuff, and it can result in all sorts of problems, birth defects, and other medical issues. So lead is contained in solder, and therefore we have to be mindful of it. And the answer for that question is, what is the danger? Well, lead can contaminate food if hands are not washed carefully after handling. So the message there, if you do some soldering and you're finished, you need to wash your hands very carefully so that you have no lead on your hands, because you can contaminate your food and the food of others. Again, lead, very dangerous. All right, very nice, but has some hazards associated with it. Okay, it's a hazardous substance. All right, so next question in the question pool. On which HF, high frequency, or MF, medium frequency, bands is a general class license holder granted all amateur frequency privileges? So let's dissect this question. So they're asking us which bands. So as we have learned before, when we are giving a frequency as an amateur radio operator, we will either give it in terms of the frequency readout, either kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, and so on, or we could give it in terms of the wavelength in meters. So those are two ways we can describe a frequency or frequency band, actually actual frequency range, or we can give it by the band using the wavelength. And as you know, the wavelength and the frequency is inversely proportional. So which HF or MF bands does a general class, and that's the level that we are studying, general class exams, general class licensee, when you pass the test, you are granted all frequency privileges. What they're asking you there, for the band, you have the entire use of the band. You're not restricted as a general class. Remember, we showed a chart where in some bands, it's restricted to, or you, as a general class, you don't have access to it. Only advanced class or extra class will have extra pieces of that. Spectrum, you don't have the full amount of the band. You can only use portions of it. Well, they're asking which of the bands, as a general class, you will actually have all of the band. And we just need to learn this. It's 160 meters, 60 meters, 30 meters, 17, 12, and 10. So you could just look at a pattern. You see 160, the next one will be 60. So let's take away the 1. And then 30 is half of 60, and just try to remember 17, 12, and 10. So you need to learn that, and that is where a general class will have full privileges across the entire piece of those bands. Other bands, amateurs are restricted as general class licensees to only portions of them. Okay. Next question in the question pool. So this is where becoming familiar, and we have shown charts, and during today's theory session as well, we will show a chart that will help us compare and contrast and remind ourselves as hams when we obtain a license, what frequency ranges we are allowed to use. So this next question is a frequency question. Okay, let's go. Which of the following frequencies is within the general class portion of the 80 meter band? Okay, so that is where learning the frequency ranges are. So I usually use 300 as a figure when I am trying to figure out, okay, what is the 10-meter band, or what is the 40-meter band, or the 80-meter band, or the 20-meter band. So how I think about it is, if someone asks me what's the 20-meter band, I say, okay, let me divide 300 by 20, and I come up with 15. So I know the frequency will be approximately 15 megahertz. All right, it'll actually 14 point something. So that's how I work out in my mind. Anytime I'm trying to translate from meter band to frequency, I use that number 300 and I divide. Okay, so we know the 80-meter band. We'll have a chart a little later on that shows what that range is. And we just need to learn that. So for example, the 80-meter band, you know, it's 3 point something or 3 something kilohertz, right? So 3560 is the correct answer. That is within the 80-meter band. All right, next question in the question pool. When general class licensees are not permitted to use the entire voice portion of a band, which portion of the voice segment is generally available to them? Okay, so that is alluding to the fact we talked about it a little while ago, that as a general class licensee, you may not have the full range of the frequencies that you can use. Some of those are reserved for advanced class and extra class licensees. But in those bands, when you're restricted, they're asking what part, and we had showed graphically or visually that general class licensees have access to the upper part of the band as opposed to the lower part. So that's the correct answer, the upper frequency end. If you need a refresh of that, just have a look at the slides in the slide deck or the videos from last session. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following frequencies is within the general class portion of the 75-meter phone band? So remember, sometimes we call that band the 80-meter phone band as well, the 80-meter band, right? So phone, of course, that is voice, and the answer is 3900. All right, so we just need to learn that as the answer, and let's move on. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following frequencies is in the general class portion of the 40-meter band in the ITU region 2? So 40-meter band, well, we know the answer is 7 point something megahertz. So 7.250, that will be the correct answer. So you see where learning or getting familiar with the various bands, 40-meter band, the 80-meter band, and the 16, those bands, knowing what frequencies line up. And we'll have a chart again in the theory session that will help us compare and contrast. And as I said, the way I try to remember it is I use 300 and I divide. And this next question actually illustrates that, right? Let's deal with the question and we'll discuss the aid to memoir afterwards. Which of the following frequencies is within the general class portion of the 20-meter phone band? So we did show the band charts, and you can look at the slides or the videos and you'll see for each of those bands what is the frequency range, and you can also see where a general class has phone. And remember, in amateur radio, anytime we talk about phone mode, that is voice or speech, or we are talking, as opposed to using a computer to generate the communication tones. We are speaking. All right. So remember I mentioned to you that how I think about it, I take 300 and then I divide it by 20 and I get 15. So I know the answer is approximately 15. So it's 14 point something. So that's how I think about it anytime I have any difficulty remembering what meter band, what's the frequency range again. I just divide by 300. Okay, so the answer for this question is 14305. The distractor questions will have frequencies outside of the phone band and outside of the 20-meter band. Okay. Which of the following frequencies is within the general class portion of the 15-meter band? Okay, so let's just test the little theory that I was mentioning to you before. So if I were to divide by 300, guess what? I'll get, if I divide 300 by 15, I'll get approximately 20. So you see, the answer is 21300. So that little rule of thumb helps me get very close to which frequency range it is. That little 300 I like to use. All right, so if you find that to be helpful to you, if it helps understand or let's say reverse engineer or backtrack, feel free to use it. All right, but the answer is 21300 kilohertz. Okay. That's the 15-meter band. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following frequencies is available to a control operator holding a general class license? So again, notice all of these questions are talking to us about general class licensees. That's the level that we are studying. Not talking about technician class. It's not talking about extra class. It's talking about us as general class licensees. All right, so which is available if you are general class? So for the 10-meter band, all of these answers are correct because all of these frequencies are available to you. Again, you just simply need to learn it, and the more familiar you are with the various bands and the privileges, it will help you in terms of learning all of this, or just learn it by rote. Okay, next question in the question pool. What portion of the 10-meter band is available for repeater use? So remember we had said that most of the HF part of the bands or spectrum, we cannot use repeaters or repeater operation. You can do repeater operation in VHF and UHF. But on the HF part of the band, the only portion that we can do repeater is in the 10-meter band, and that portion is above 29.5 megahertz. So you need to learn that as to repeater use in the HF spectrum, 29.5 and above. Okay, next question in the question pool. When may a 10-meter repeater retransmit the 2-meter signal from a station that has a technician class control operator? So let's dissect this question a little bit. So we are saying that there's a 10-meter repeater. All right, so that's the 28 megahertz band, and the 2-meter signal, so that's in the 144 megahertz portion of the band. Now, this is a technician class control operator that's on the 2-meter band, but there's a repeater, a crossband repeater, that is able to repeat on 10 meters. So the only way that could occur is if the 10-meter repeater control operator, that's the person who is on the 10-meter side of it, that person holds at least a general class license. Because if that person is only a technician class, that is not possible. So we need to learn that's a condition of the licensing. Okay, and it's a restriction. See, one of the reasons why we do encourage persons to attain the highest class of license that you can, because you get maximum privileges and least restrictions. So that's a bit of an incentive to get your technician, yes, but also upgrade to general and possibly upgrade into the extra class. Those are the 3 classes that are available. All of the other classes that we talk about inside of the course, novice and advanced and so on, those are grandfathered classes. They're not available anymore, but persons who hold those classes can continue to use them. All right, next question in the question pool. On which of the following bands is phone operation prohibited? So let's dissect this question. So we learned the last session that we have some restrictions on the various bands, but they're asking us here about what band can we not speak on? That's essentially the question here. Which of the bands? Is it the 160-meter band, the 80-meter band, the 40-meter band, the 30-meter band, the 12, and so on? Which of the bands can you not talk on? You have to use some other mode other than phone operation or speech. And we learned last class that the 30-meter band is that band that we cannot use any phone. And not only phone, there's another restriction. Will come the next question. We cannot do phone operation on the 30-meter band. It's prohibited. Next question. Similar question, similar answer. On which of the following bands is image transmission prohibited? So transmitting an image, so let's say like slow scan TV, SSTV, sending a fax or something like that. It's again the 30-meter band, you cannot send images. The good thing about it is you only have to learn one answer for these 2 questions. It's the 30-meter band, it's the 30-meter band. Okay. So let's go. Okay, so another oddball band, or the oddball band. All right. Which of the following amateur bands is restricted to communications only on specific channels rather than frequency ranges? Let's dissect this question. So we may have learned as amateur radio operators, we have our radio, our transceivers, and we have our tuning button, a tuning knob. Just like we'll have our AM, FM radio, and we'll tune around the dial. We do that as amateur radio operators on our transceiver as well. And usually, and most ham bands, Amateurs have what we call VFO mode, which is we can tune to any frequency within the range that our license allows us to transmit. We can tune inside of there and transmit on any frequency. Once we stay clear of band edges, you may remember that. You don't want to go and transmit at the band edge because you might be transmitting illegally or causing harmful interference. So once you're within your band, you can transmit usually in almost any of the bands, except the 60-meter band. That band is channelized. So you cannot just jump on any frequency. You have to go to specific frequencies, whether you're doing USB or whether you're doing CW. There are specific frequencies, and it's 5 of them actually. So the answer to where you can only communicate on specific channels or channelized operations rather than tuning to any frequency or the frequency range, it's the 60-meter band. Sometimes we call it the oddball band. All right, next question. All right, and if you remember, that's around 5 megahertz, just by the way. So again, if you test the little theory that I was giving you about 300, if you divide 300 by 60, you'll get about 5, right? So there you go. So the 300 works. All right, let's go again. Which of the following applies when the FCC rules designate the amateur service as a secondary user on a band? So let's dissect this question. What are they asking us? So first of all, we are talking about FCC rules saying that as amateurs, we are secondary on the band. We are not primary, we are secondary. But what does that really mean? So we talked about it last session. We said we have to give way, right, to the primary users. So that's the difference when you are primary on versus secondary. When you're secondary, you have to accept harmful interference, and you may not yourself cause any harmful interference. So let's go with the answer. The answer is amateur stations are allowed to use the band only if they do not cause harmful interference to the primary users. So if you're talking or communicating on a band that you're secondary, and a primary user service that has primary access to that band comes up, you either give way, you change frequency, or you stop using it altogether. That's what you do, which is, I guess, the answer to the next question. What is the appropriate action if, when operating on either the 30-meter band or the 60-meter band, a station in the primary service interferes with your contact? So you are communicating and then somebody comes up on either of these bands who are primary users and they interfere with you. Can you go and quarrel with them and insist that they move? No, not at all. You are the one. You either move to a clear frequency or you stop transmitting altogether because you are secondary. So let's test our little 300 theory again. So what is the 30-meter band? Well, I am not too sure. Let's try our trusty formula. Divide 300 by 30, we get 10. So we know the 30-meter band is around 10 megahertz or so. And we could do the same thing as we just did with this 60-meter band. Divide 300 by 60, and we'll get 5 megahertz. All right, little tips. How do we remember all of this until it becomes second nature to us? We have to have little ways to remind ourselves and figure things out and calculate. All right, moving right along. And when we're finished with the question pool, we will take a short break before we dive into our theory. Next question in question pool. The frequency allocations of which ITU region applies to radio amateurs operating in North and South America. All right. So ITU, International Telecommunications Union, and we learned using a chart or a map of the world last session that North and South America are in ITU Region 2. There's also Region 1 and there's Region 3. But we are in, most of the persons, actually I think all of the persons that are in our sessions are in fact in Region 2, whether we're in the Caribbean, whether we are in North America, meaning the United States or Canada, we are all in Region 2. So those are the frequency allocations that apply to us. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following may apply in areas under FCC jurisdiction outside of ITU Region 2? So I think we use Guam as a good example. Guam is actually not in Region 2, but it's under FCC jurisdiction. Well, what happens there is frequency allocations may differ. That's what happens if that place that you have jurisdiction of is not in Region 2. may not be able to use the same frequencies as region 2. You may have to use that particular restrictions according to those regions. Next question in the question pool. What is the maximum height above ground to which an antenna structure may be erected without requiring notification to the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, and registration with the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, provided it is not at or near a public use airport? So what they're saying to us is, when do we not need to seek permission from the FAA or the FCC as long as you're not near an airport? What's the maximum height that you can go to without having to notify or register? The magic answer is 200 feet. So keep the tip of your antenna from the ground to less than 200 feet and you're good to go. You don't need to seek permission. If you're going higher than that, you need to notify and register. Okay. Next question. Under what conditions are state and local government, under what conditions are state and local governments permitted to regulate amateur radio antenna structures? So we talked around that last session, and the answer is amateur service communications must be reasonably accommodated. That's by those local and state governments. And regulations must constitute the minimum practical to accommodate a legitimate purpose of the state or local entity. In other words, they cannot be arbitrary, or in Trinidad and Tobago, as we say, they can't be operating by VAPs. All right, you have to have a good reason. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following is a purpose of a beacon station as identified in the FCC rules? So what they're asking us is what are beacons used for? And as hams, we observe propagation and reception. Next question in the question pool. What is the power limit for beacon stations? So we learned last class, 100 watts peak envelope power output, 100 watts PEP. Next question. With which of the following conditions must beacon stations comply? All right. Well, first off, one of those conditions. Well, there must be no more than one beacon signal transmitting in the same band from the same station location. So if you have a beacon on, let's say, 40 meters, for example, let's say you have a beacon there. You cannot have another beacon on 40 meters, let's say, for example, or let's say 10 meters. You cannot have two beacon stations at the same location. If you have to have another beacon station, it must be at another location. All right. Next question in the question pool. On what HF frequencies are automatically controlled beacons permitted? All right. So what they're saying basically, it's unattended beacons. So you're not around, it's automatically controlled. You are nowhere near around and you have no interaction with that beacon transmitter. So that's called automatically controlled beaconing. And they're asking what frequencies are permitted? Well, we simply need to learn that the answer is 28.2 to 28.3 megahertz. That's in the 10 meter band. Okay, last question before the break. Why should an amateur operator normally avoid transmitting on 14.100, 18.110, 21.150, 24.930, and 28.200? Well, all of those frequencies are part of a beacon system. So the answer is because a system of propagation beacon stations operates on those frequencies. So therefore, as an amateur radio operator, when you're going to communicate, you're going to have what we call a QSO, a conversation with another amateur radio operator, you do not go on these frequencies because you will be interfering with those beacons, and those beacons actually will help you know if you are propagation or not. So why would you want to go on those frequencies and interfere? So we will now take a short 2-minute break or so. Get up, take a stretch, have a bathroom break, have some water, and we will come right back and we'll go straight into our question pool. Sorry, not into the question pool, we'll go straight into our theory as we have completed our question pool for today. Okay, welcome back everyone. And just to mention, just before we started our session today, we were just demoing again the FT8 digital mode, what it looks like when you're operating FT8. Okay, so let's go straight into the theory for this evening's session. So we will be running a little beyond our usual 9:30 stop time so that we can cover some more material. So trust that is okay with all of the participants. So let's go straight into our theory. So as amateur radio operators, we recognize that normally when we are communicating, it's two-way communication. That's why sometimes we refer to as two-way radio communications. You have two parties and you're having a conversation, as we will say in amateur radio, a QSO, with someone, whether that is voice communication or it could be a digital mode where you're using a computer to communicate with another amateur radio operator in your country or another country. So it's normally two-way. However, as hams, we have a couple of instances where there are one-way transmissions that are permissible. One of those is when weather information is sent out or propagation forecast information is sent out from US government stations. So that's a sort of exception, if you want to call it, where one-way transmission exists or is allowed on the amateur radio bands. The other one would be Morse code tutorials, where a station may send blind transmissions or transmissions just out with Morse code without actually communicating with anyone. So for example, sample Morse code so that a person can listen and copy down the Morse code. They will hear it on air and then they will write it down. That station that's transmitting the Morse code is actually not communicating with anyone really. There's no reply, there's no acknowledgement. So that's a one-way transmission. And the reason why that is done is to assist persons who wish to learn Morse code. And on the right-hand side of your slide, we have a little schedule with the ARRL Morse code tutorial sessions. The station is Whiskey 1 Alpha Whiskey, and during these days and times, Morse code is transmitted for persons to listen to and copy. So that's an example of that one-way transmission also. And for the exam, we need to learn that occasional retransmission of weather and propagation forecast information from US government stations are permitted. Also, transmissions necessary to assist learning the international Morse code is also permitted. So those are two examples where one-way transmission is permitted or permissible in the amateur radio world. All right. So we dealt with this during the technician class, but again, it comes up again in the general class. And, back in the day, or in the times past, some countries, communication was not allowed if you held an FCC amateur radio license. Nowadays, however, I don't think there's any country really where communication is not permitted. That is hardly ever so. Not aware of any currently. However, we need to know that as an amateur radio operator licensed in the US, you can communicate with any country except those where the ITU has been notified by those administrations that they object to the communication. So if country X says to ITU, we don't want anybody communicating with us, and ITU informs the various countries, here's what, no one is to communicate with country X or territory X, well, so be it. As far as we know, none exist at the moment, but for the purpose of the exam, you need to know if those exceptions come into play, and maybe one day they may, hopefully not. You have to abide by that. So you need to learn this, that it is permissible to communicate with other amateur stations in countries outside the areas administered by the FCC when the contact is with amateurs in any country except those whose administrations have notified the ITU that they object to such communications. And this is what comes in the exam. Also, as amateur radio operators, we are not allowed to encrypt or to obfuscate, or our communications has to be clear text so that they can be interpreted by anyone. We must not be hiding any of our messages as amateur radio operators. So we say that you can use abbreviations, you can use pro signs and pro words in your communication, but you have to make sure they do not obfuscate or obscure your meaning at all. There are no secrets, no hidden or coded messages at all in amateur radio operator. You can encode them and decode them, but it must be known, well known what they are. So you cannot obscure, and that's the point of bullet point 2. The restrictions and the use of abbreviations and procedural signals in the amateur service is that they may be used if they do not obscure the meaning of the message, right? So you cannot transmit something that everyone will not be able to understand, right? Everyone must be able to understand whatever transmissions as an amateur sends, okay? That's most important as part of the amateur radio service. And speaking of which, we had discussed digital modes where a computer will be connected to a transceiver. And remember I said once we say digital modes in amateur radio, it's usually a computer that's connected to a radio or a transceiver or a transmitter. And those digital protocols, a 1 will mean something, a 0 will mean something, and combinations of 1s and 0s will mean something. And those digital modes like FT8 and JT65 and all the other modes, RITI, that we encountered before, when those protocols are developed, it must be publicly available as to what those digital signals mean. There must not be any secret or confidentiality as to what it means. So we say that before any new digital mode or digital protocol goes on the air, you must document it on the technical characteristics so that everyone can examine that protocol and see what you're doing. So yes, you are encoding using digital modes, but it must not be secret, it must not be confidential, it must not be unknown as to when you send a signal what it is. So that's the last bullet point here. Before using a new digital protocol such as FT8 or GT65 or FT4 or RITI or any one of those modes, on the air, it is necessary to publicly document the technical characteristics of the protocol. Yeah? All right. So anyone recognize this gentleman here? All right, so let's go. Now, when we are licensed as amateur radio operators, there's something called good amateur practice, and we'll define what that is in a little bit, or how do we determine, or where do we get what that is. But we need to make sure that as an amateur radio operator, when you become licensed, whether you're licensed as a technician class licensee or a general class licensee or as an extra class licensee, whatever, make sure that you use the frequency and the modes that are within your license class. In other words, stay in your lane. Don't get out of your lane. You must observe that as a condition of your license. You may wish to use spectrum or modes outside of your license class, but the way to do that is to upgrade your license, not just to decide, hey, let me try using that. I'm seeing spectrum, I'm seeing modes, let me try to use it. No, you must make sure that you stick within your license class. If you want to do more, you see more spectrum there that you want to have access to transmit on. You see modes there that you want to do that you currently are not able to because of the restrictions of your license class. Study, sit the exam, and boom, you can then access those frequencies and modes as proper. Right. Also, the other thing we discussed it previously, is that we need to follow the band plans. Remember, the band plan was a voluntary series of what frequency you can use for what purposes and so on inside of the spectrum as a ham that you have access to. Well, make sure that you stick to the band plan. So if the band plan says that in a particular part of the spectrum it's for this mode, then stick with that. Try to avoid going and doing a mode outside of what is generally accepted. You'll be kind of operating maverick there, and that's not very good. We need cooperation as amateur radio operators. Also, the last point in terms of good amateur practice, and we had said this before, a couple of times in the general class. We also discussed it in the technician class. Before you transmit, and remember as an amateur radio operator, what you're getting a license to do is transmit. Remember, a lot of times you can get a shortwave radio, quote unquote, and listen to transmissions. But the beauty about becoming a licensed amateur radio operator is you now have privileges to transmit because you are trained, you're educated, you are certified, you have some knowledge that permits you to now transmit because you have the information to avoid causing harmful interference and shooting yourself and others in the foot. So before you transmit on any frequency, you need to monitor. In other words, listen first. See and make sure, or listen to see if the frequency is in use, because there may be an emergency that is taking place and you don't want to go and just run over everyone and cause that interference. So you want to monitor the frequency before transmitting. And that's these couple of bullet points at the start here. And note that it's the FCC that determines what good engineering and good amateur practice is as applied to an amateur station. And you have the Part 97. We would have circulated that during the technician class. We also circulated it as handouts during the general class, and of course the links and the emails that everyone has gotten there. If you click on those links, we have all of the handouts, all of the material that's been distributed, including a full copy of Part 97 in PDF form. So that's a good document to have a look at, because a lot of the theory that we're discussing, those things come from Part 97, which is the rules and regulations. And the FCC determines what's good engineering and good amateur practice, anything that's not covered by Part 97. And we need to know this for the exam. So, like everything else, we need to be aware of what we can and cannot do. And for the various bands, apart from knowing what frequencies we can transmit on, what range of frequencies, remember we have that band chart. Apart from the frequency, we need to know how much power we can use. How many watts can we transmit using our transmitter or transceiver? We need to be aware of that. And it's different for the differing bands. So on some bands, you can do a particular amount of output. Another band, you can do another amount of output maximum. And we have a little chart here coming up that you will be able to do a little reference. Remember, we try to compare and contrast and put everything into perspective. So we have a little chart that will come up in a short while, in a couple slides from now, that will summarize some of this. But what we need to learn for the exam is that on the 28 meter band, as a general class licensee, you can do up to a maximum of 1,500 watts or 1.5 kilowatts. And that is peak envelope power output. So that's the first point here that we have. Now on this chart that's been circulated before, the band chart, we have extracted, pulled it out a little bit, and you can see here, for example, on the 28 megahertz band, which is also the 10 meter band. Remember that little trusty formula we said, if you want to find out, just use 300. If you have the 28 megahertz band, you divide that into 300, what do you get? Approximately 10. All right, so the little rule of thumb is working, yes? All right. So note that we have the band that's put out here. And notice this is also taken from that same band chart where it says that no station may transmit exceeding 1.5 kilowatts or 1,500 watts peak envelope power. And in a little while, we'll talk about, again, we did discuss what PEP or PEP is before, but we will discuss what it is again coming up in a little while. But we just need to know that all of the power limits, the maximum power outputs that we are talking about is peak envelope power, not average power, it's PEP. All right, so for 28 megahertz band, we can do a maximum as 1,500 watts as a general class operator. And if you want to know, is that a cool thing or not? Well, technician class operators, remember we showed last class how to read this band chart? Well, you have E for extra, A for advanced, G for general, N for novice, T for technician. Notice novices and technicians could only do 200 watts. So when you upgrade to a general class, you can do 1,500 watts. Wow, what a thing. So you see, there are incentives and good things that come with upgrading your class of license. Right. So that's the 28 megahertz band. The 1.8 megahertz band, or the what we call the 160 meter band, You can also do 1500 watts. Yes, you can as an amateur radio operator. 1500 watts on the 1.8 megahertz band. As a matter of fact, you'll see a little pattern developing that we will show very clearly in a chart that is coming up. Those parts of the HF spectrum, you can generally do about 1500 watts. There are little exceptions. So 1500 watts, and that's why the ARRL's band chart says it here. 1.5 kilowatts generally on the HF spectrum is what you can do as a general class and certainly extra class and so on. Technicians, not so much, right? Where you have HF privileges, you're usually restricted in power. So 1.8 megahertz, also 1500 watts peak envelope power. So both frequency spectrum or the bands that we have talked about so far, the maximum power that you're allowed is still 1500 watts for those two bands. Let's go to another band. What about the 12-meter band or the 24 megahertz portion of the band? How much are you allowed as a general class operator? Guess what? The same 1500 watts peak envelope power. So you see, so the answer to all of the questions in the question pool so far, when they ask you how much as a general class can you do on 28 megahertz, it's 1500 watts. As a general class operator, how much can you do on 1.8 megahertz? 1500 watts. On the 12-meter band, as a general class operator, what can you do? It's also 1500 watts. Right? So that hopefully makes it a little easier to remember the answers to these types of questions. Notice, however, when it comes to the 30-meter band or the 10 megahertz band, the maximum transmitting power an amateur station may use is 200 watts. Remember, we said the 30-meter band is a little bit of a different band, a very narrow piece of spectrum, and also the modes that you can do. Remember what we said about the 30-meter band? Yes, you said you couldn't do some certain modes, right? You can't do voice, you can't do image. But notice also that you're limited to 200 watts. So you need to learn for the 30-meter band or the 10 megahertz band, 200 watts peak envelope power. And that's the point of the last bullet point here. The maximum transmit power on 10.140 megahertz is 200 watts PEP. All right, so let's talk about the oddball band, which is the 60-meter band. You also have some restrictions there as well. So first of all, when you are operating on the 60-meter band, if you're using an antenna other than a dipole, and we show what a dipole is here, we dealt with this during the technician and the general class. We showed what a dipole looks like. So this is a dipole antenna here. If you're using an antenna other than that, meaning an antenna that has gain, such as a Yagi antenna or a directional antenna or any antenna that has any kind of gain, it is a requirement of the STC rules that you must keep a record of the gain of your antenna. That's if you're using an antenna other than a basic or standard dipole antenna. So that's an exam question, and you must learn this very well. And you must also keep a record if you have a station and it's something other than a dipole that you're using, meaning an antenna with some sort of gain, you must record it. Also note that the maximum power on the 60-meter band will be also reduced. It's 100 watts peak envelope power. And again, on the band chart, the same band chart has it, it looks a little cryptic. Look, it's right here in brackets, 100 watts. So they're saying the extra class, the advanced class, the general class can use this. It's channelized, as we said before. Remember the 60-meter band, it's not VFO. You can't just tune to any frequency. It's channelized, very specific. Whether you're doing digital modes or CW, you have to use a specific frequency. If you're using single sideband USB, it's a particular frequency, and it's 5 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 channels, channelized operations. You don't have VFO. You can't choose any frequency you want. So that's the other part of this band being oddball. But notice, maximum of 100 watts. You cannot do 1500 watts on this band. Right, so I did promise we'll discuss a little bit about what PEP is. So it simply means peak envelope power as opposed to average power. So we just need to know for the exam that all of the power levels, when we specify the limits, the maximum power output, it is PEP or peak envelope power. And peak envelope power, just by the way, occurs at the peaks of the modulation cycle. So you see from here to here, there's a peak. When that occurs in the modulation, you actually have the RMS power output that is calculated at this point, and that is considered peak envelope power. And that's different to, let's say, average power, which may be something like here. So we're talking about the peak envelope power, and we need to learn this for the exam. All of those power limits are peak or peak envelope power, not average power, not any other form. It's PEP. Also, apart from the fact that the band chart and the rules and regulations will tell us as an amateur radio operator that you can use 1500 watts, for example, on the 160 meter band. The other concept is, as amateur radio operators, we discussed this during the technician class as well. Use only the amount of power that you're required to use to make the contact. So in other words, if 100 watts would have worked, use 100 watts. You don't need to go up to 1500 watts if you have that capability. If 10 watts would work to make the contact, use the 10 watts. You don't need to run 100 watts or 1000 watts or 1500 watts. Or you don't have to run maximum. Use only what is necessary to make that contact. Again, that's also an exam question that comes in the general class. Use only the minimum power necessary to carry out the desired communications. So we're coming to digital modes now. Again, remember when we said digital modes? A digital mode is where we use a computer and connect it to a radio transceiver to send the communications and to also receive and decode the communications. So those digital modes, for example, are RTTY, RTTY, radio teletype, or any other form of data such as GT65, Pactor, FT8. All of those are digital modes because we need a computer running software to be able to connect to our radio transmitter to generate those tones, to send it via the airwaves, and also to receive those signals and to decode those signals on our computer and show us on the screen, just like what we were demoing at the beginning of the session, where you saw a lot of words and text coming up, contacts taking place. All of that is computer generated. All right, so we need to learn that on USB frequencies in the 60 meter band, you have a maximum bandwidth of 2.8 kilohertz. So you just need to learn that, and we have a little diagram that shows here what that 2.8 kilohertz channel is. So USB upper sideband on the 60 meter band. So we need to learn that 60 meter band USB maximum bandwidth is 2.8 kilohertz. Magic number. All right. We also need to learn a bunch of other things here as well in terms of what is the maximum symbol rate for the various digital modes on the various bands. So there's a bit of learning that we have to do. However, we have a chart that's coming up in a little bit, which will hopefully give a little reference point to all of this text that we're seeing here. So when we do digital transmissions, so you may recall we were showing digital transmissions, and you will have a symbol or symbols, and then another one, and so on. And we were saying that when you send a signal, that signal could either represent one or more value. So that signal transition, when we go from one signal level to another signal level, that is considered the baud rate. Now, some people will say, but wait a minute, I'm hearing about a bit rate as well. So usually the bit rate could be higher than the baud rate. And the reason that is if you have a baud rate of a certain amount, you can, with each signal, send more than one bit of data. And if you do that, your bit rate will be higher than your baud rate. Because even though you have one signal transition, you could actually send 2 bits of data. So therefore, your bit rate will be higher. If you only send 1 bit of data with one signal transition, well, then your bit rate and your baud rate will be exactly the same. But as you have these signal transitions, we need to learn as hams, there's a maximum rate that we can use in these signal transmissions or signal transitions on HF or any of the frequencies as hams that we have access to. There are limits. We cannot just run any old baud rate or signal transition rate that we wish. We have to stay within our range that's permissible, and we have to learn what those signal rates are for the various bands. So let's go. The maximum symbol rate permitted for RTTY or any data transmission on the 20 meter band is 300 baud. And I'll show a little chart in a little bit that actually shows that 300 baud is for any frequency below 25 megahertz. All right, so you'll see that in a little bit. So we just need to learn that the 20 meter band, 300 baud. Maximum rate. The maximum rate for RTTY or digital transmission on frequencies below 28 megahertz is 300 baud. So anything below that is 300 baud. The maximum symbol rate for those digital transmissions on the 10 meter band, however, is a higher value. It's 1200 baud. Let's go again. The maximum symbol rate for any digital transmission on the 2 meter band, even higher, 19.6 kilobaud or 19,600 baud. And then the maximum symbol rate for digital transmissions on the 1.25 meter band, and the 1.25 meter band, that's 220 megahertz, and the 70 centimeter band, and that is the 400 megahertz band, is 19.6. This is an error. This should actually be 56,000 kilobaud. So I'll correct that in the next slide. All right, so I'll show you a chart coming up now in terms of the reference point for all of this. All right, so you don't need to learn this chart. This is just a chart we've been presenting from time to time to show, you know, a sort of bird's eye view of everything. This is the same chart that you would have seen where we compare the various frequencies that hams have access to and what the wavelength is and whether it's MF or HF or VHF, UHF. And we also showed what part of the bands you can use lower sideband and upper sideband. And we have just added on the baud rate limits to the various pieces of the spectrum so you could get a visual representation. So you could see that on all of these lower frequencies here in the MF and HF, from 1.8 megahertz all the way up to just below 28 megahertz, you can see all of this. It's 300 baud that you're allowed to do. And then on the 10 meter band, you have 1200 baud you can do. And then on the 6 meter and the 2 meter band, you have 19,600 or 19.6 kilobaud. And on the 1.25 centimeter and the 70 centimeter bands, you can do 56 kilobaud. And even though I didn't put it on the chart, there's really no limit to the other bands as you go up. And you may be asking yourself the question, why is it that there's such low signal rate or symbol rate on this part of the spectrum, the HF spectrum, and how come it's so much higher when you go into these high VHF and UHF frequencies? The simple answer to that question is why it's low and it becomes much higher on these frequencies is the amount of bandwidth that you have access to. In the HF spectrum is limited, so therefore you cannot do a signal, because the symbol rate translates to the amount of bandwidth that is of spectrum that the signal will occupy. And because in the HF part of the spectrum here, you have very limited bandwidth, you cannot with one transmission take up the entire bandwidth. That's like saying you have a 3-lane highway and your vehicle is occupying all 3 lanes and nobody else could drive on the highway or the roadway. So you have to be considerate of all the other users, and you have to limit yourself according to the regulations as to how much lanes you can use. And that's what's happening here as well. On the HF part of the spectrum, you don't have much lanes or many lanes or wide lanes. So you have to have a small, I say small up yourself. You have to make the signal small to fit within so that several people could be inside of this part of the spectrum. But where you have much larger bandwidths, look at this here, look at the kind of spectrum you have here. Wide range, 20-something megahertz of spectrum as opposed to point-something of a megahertz here. You can have much wider symbol rates on those frequencies. So just a little reference point. You don't need to learn this, but I'm hoping that it will help you to, reference everything that we have talked about, a bird's eye view, so that you can put things into its little bucket and into its little cubby hole to understand reference to one another. If it helps you learn, great. So we now come to the concept of volunteer examiners. So we did say during the orientation that once we have completed the course, when you're ready, you can take the exams. And we did say that exams are administered by volunteer examiners, or what we refer to as VEs. And props to the VEs, because this is done out of the goodness of their heart, and it's also their giving back to amateur radio. So some of us here, we would encourage you, as you become licensed, consider becoming a VE, giving back and assisting and encouraging other hams to get their license. But of course, there are some things we need to know about the VE system. The first one is that we need to be aware that volunteer examiners are accredited by an organization that's referred to as a VEC, or a Volunteer Examiner Coordinator. That is what VEC is. And their organizations, there are about 14 of them currently. There may be more depending on how it goes, but the examples we give, ARRL, for example, is one of the biggest, probably the largest VEC. You also have W5YI. You also have the GLAARG, which is the Greater Los Angeles Amateur Radio Group. So those are examples of the Volunteer Examiner Coordinator, the VECs, right? So if you have to become a volunteer examiner, that is who accredits you, the VEC, the Volunteer Examiner Coordinator. We also need to be aware that there's a criteria. If you are a non-US citizen, there's a criteria that must be met for you to become an accredited volunteer examiner. And that is, you, that person, must hold a US amateur radio license of general class or above. So you can be a non-US citizen, and there are many in Trinidad and Tobago. You can be a VE, a volunteer examiner. You can be accredited by a VEC, but to do so, you must hold an FCC license. You must hold one of a general class or above, meaning general class, advanced class, or extra class. Also, to become a volunteer examiner, you must be over the age of 18 and above. Minimum age, 18 years. So again, all of these are exam questions. Right. So you may be wondering, but can I become a VE if I'm a technician class? No, you cannot. You need to be a minimum of a general class operator or a general class licensee to become a VE. So you can be a general class, you can be an extra class, and you can be a VE that way. But we also need to know that depending on your class of license, if you're a general class, you can only examine for the technician class. If you're an extra class, you can examine for all of the levels. You can examine technician, you can examine general, and you can examine extra class. So the extra class has the greatest level of flexibility. So we need to learn this for the exam, that a general class operator may only be accredited to administer technician class exams. Right? Note that technician class person cannot become a VE to examine anybody. Right? So we have a little handy chart here that shows if you are this class, what you can examine. Also, and put another way, it's kind of the same thing but adding a little bit of information. We say that a person must have an FCC general class or higher license as well as VEC accreditation. Remember what we said a VEC is? Volunteer Examiner Coordinator. So apart from having a general class or higher, you need to have VEC accreditation before you can be an administering VE or volunteer examiner for the technician class license. Right, so just a little embellishment on the first point, but these are also exam questions. And, you know, this chart on the right-hand side here kind of speaks to it. If you are having any issues understanding, hopefully this chart will simplify this verbiage here. Also, we need to be aware that a requirement for administering a technician class license exam is that you need at least 3 accredited general class or higher VEs that must be there. So that's the other thing. You wouldn't have one VE administering the exam. It has to be at least 3 persons who are accredited by the VEC, and they must be general class or higher to be able to administer a technician class. So one VE who is general class cannot administer an exam. It has to be 3 persons. So it's a commitment, and when you become licensed, you may want to consider, and we like to encourage you to consider becoming a VE or volunteer examiner. to give back. Very rewarding, where you can help others become licensed amateur radio operators. So lots of opportunities to volunteer as a ham or as an amateur radio operator. So what happens when we sit an exam? We get something called the CSCE. And on the right hand side here, this is what the ARRL CSCE looks like. It's the Certificate of Successful Completion of Examination. We touched on this during the technician class. We also discussed it during the orientation of the general class. This is your certificate that you get after you sit and pass the exam. The VEs will give you this. This is your certificate, but it's only valid for exam credit for 1 year, 365 days. This certificate is valid for. All right, so you need to know that for the exam. Of course, that's not a big deal, because once you get the certificate, the next thing is for you to get your license, and that is what is renewed periodically. So this is just your certificate after you have sat it, that you could become licensed afterwards. Okay, if you are a technician class operator, so you have already sat the technician class, you assigned a call sign, but you decide to go and now do the general class exams. So if you have your CSCE from the general class, you can actually operate on the general class, even though you have technically not yet appeared on the FCC website as a general class. You are still showing up as a technician class, but you have your CSCE. You can operate in the general class segment of the band. Those additional privileges that you have as a general class, you can use it, even though on the website it says you're a technician class. Yes, you are a technician class operator, but you have your CSCE, and that is what authorizes you to operate as a general class operator, or to use the privileges of a general class operator just fine. And if you do that, you need to identify yourself by using the two letters Alpha Golf or AG after your call sign. If you are still a technician class licensee, according to the website, it shows you here as a technician class. It doesn't yet show as general class because the VEs haven't yet sent in the paperwork and the FCC hasn't turned it around as yet. And you're still showing up as a technician class, but you passed your exam. You have your CSCE for general class. You can use the privileges of general class. You just need to identify yourself when you're giving your call signs and having that identifier as a suffix Alpha Golf. So you will give your call sign, whatever it is, Alpha Golf. So you can use your general class privileges right away as soon as you get this piece of paper that says that you are upgrading from a technician to a general. You have passed the exam. Even though you're still a technician class according to the database, you can use your general class privileges. Just bear in mind what you need to do so. Use the Alpha Golf or the AG after your call sign to indicate to persons, because they will look you up on the database and say, but wait a minute, this person is a technician class. How come he or she is on the general class portion of the band doing general class modes? Well, you have just identified yourself, Alpha Golf, to say, hey, I actually have my CSCE for general class, and therefore I'm permitted. All right, so our last slide. There is a grace period if your license expires. Now, we want to say, please, as we have appealed before during the technician class and the orientation of the general class, please try not to let your license expire. Make sure you renew on time. However, if your license were to expire, you have 2 years grace period that you could renew without having to redo any exam. But what happens if 2 years elapsed, meaning that you did not renew your license, your FCC license that is, and 2 years passed and you want to renew? Can you just go and pay? No, you cannot. After 2 years, you have to do at least the technician class exam. Now, if you can prove that you were previously licensed as a general class or an advanced class or an extra class, and you want to get back that class of license, you can get partial credit if you can show that you held that license before, but you still have to do an exam, but only one exam. You just have to do the technician exam. So you might have been an extra class. For whatever reason, the license lapsed. 2 years passed. Now, if you are within the 2 years, meaning that it only lasts for just under 2 years, you can just simply go and renew and you're good to go. But if more than 2 years has passed since your license expired, meaning that you cannot use your license, you cannot use your call sign, you don't have a valid call sign anymore because it's expired, you will have to now do an exam. But guess what? Long ago, you used to have to, let's say if you're an extra class and you lost your license because it expired and the 2 years grace period has passed, you used to have to go and do the technician plus the general plus the extra to get back your extra class license. But now, all you need to do, if you held a general class or if you held an extra class and you want to get it back, it expired, all you need to do is sit the technician class exam. And that's the point here, the other bullet points that we have here. We say that any person who can demonstrate that they once held an FCC general, advanced or extra, and it was not revoked, meaning that your license was not cancelled or revoked by the FCC for some reason, you could receive that partial credit for that expired license that you had. And the next point is, if you want, all you have to do is pass the current element 2, what is called the technician class exam. Remember, there's element 2, element 3, and element 4. Well, element 2 is also called the technician class exam. So that's just good to know. I hope you never have to use that knowledge practically, but it is part of your exam and you need to know it for it. But please, don't let your license expire. You have worked too hard for it. And it's really a simple matter of renewal. It used to be no cost before, and very soon there will be a small, I think, $35 US fee to renew for 10 years. So please, don't let it expire. Put it in your calendar. Put it somewhere that you'll remember when your license is expiring to renew it. You have, I think, 90 days. You could start to renew before it expires, and you have 2 years grace period. But remember, also, we said when your license has expired, you cannot use it. Even within the grace period, you cannot somehow come up and transmit and use the call sign. Your license has expired. The only way you can transmit is if you renew. So some people think, well, I'm within the grace period. I didn't renew the license. I could still somehow use my call sign. No, you cannot. You must renew before you can use the call sign legally. So folks, that's it. We did go a little over again as we have been the last few sessions. Thank you for the extra time, everyone. Just would like to remind everyone, please check out this website, 9y59ind.info. Has a wealth of information about the special event that is still going on in Trinidad and Tobago, a special event call sign that's been issued by the Telecom Authority for this special event to recognize the 59th independence of Trinidad and Tobago. It started on the 22nd of August and it runs to the 12th of September. So please check out the website. A lot of information about the event, much more than I can give in the few minutes that we have to provide little info briefs during our course. So check out the website, please. Give it a look up. There are a lot of information inside of there. And while we are doing our course, there's not a lot of practicals that we are doing in the course. And I will point you to some of this information so you can get your feet wet, get into, the whole amateur radio psyche, wrap your arm around it. And this is one way that you can do so. Even though you may not be licensed as yet, you can certainly check out the information and start to get a feel for what are some of these things. That's why before the class started, we were shown a little bit of the FT8 mode, what it actually looks like, what as a ham radio operator you'll be doing with FT8. Apart from laying all these great theories, what does it actually look like, feel it and touch it? So please check out the website for some further insight into amateur radio. You will see quite a lot on the pages. You will see some graphics. You will see some screens that will show propagation. It will show amateur radio transmissions. It will show logs where there are contacts that are made. You will see some videos, quite a bit of information that will supplement the knowledge that you're gaining via the theoretical concepts that we are discussing. Remember, amateur radio is a very practical, hands-on, and we are basically doing virtual presentations and theoretical for you to assist you in passing the exam, which we know you will be successful in. But it's a very practical aspect as well. And some ways to get into it is to look at some of these presentations, some of the activities, and the website has quite a bit of information. So Hopefully I've convinced everyone to at least take a look at the website if you haven't already done so. And by the way, if you looked at it a week ago, quite a lot has changed on the website as well. So I encourage you to check back regularly. Almost every day we have updates to that website. So folks, thank you so much. Our next session will, God's willing, be Friday the 17th of September. That's next Saturday at 8:30 p.m. We are drawing very close to our last session. We'll probably have just maybe 2 more sessions afterwards. So that will be a wrap. So folks, thank you so much for staying the course. Really appreciate it. The vast majority of persons have stuck with it. And we have a pretty large class, and this is very encouraging. We'll be discussing with you towards the end, do you want us to run the extra class as well? So based on your feedback. So folks, do have yourselves a good night. Thank you so much for the extra time. Be safe, take good care, and do have a great weekend. Okay, Sylvester, good night as well. You're certainly welcome. Ramzan, good night too. Yeah, you're certainly welcome also. You take good care, man. All right. Oh, yes, Adish. Yes, right. So glad you mentioned that, Adish. So on the same website, there is a blog, a video blog that you might very well be interested, everyone, to take a look at. A little interview with someone who is actually a director of the ARRL, and she actually is a native Trinbagonian, and we had a little interview session talking about the special event. So please check out the website. There is a video somewhere towards the bottom there, Real Shack. So thanks a lot, Adish. Yes, glad you mentioned that. Please check it out. And certainly a pleasure, Gary. Glad you liked it. You have a good night as well. Take good care. Jermaine, thank you so much for the encouragement and the feedback. Really appreciate it. And you too have a great weekend. Be safe. All right, George, have a good rest too, man. Yes, you're certainly welcome. And Anthony, you too, have a good night. Take care, all the best. Thanks so much for your feedback. All right, Jessica, good night as well. Take care. Roger, good night. Desi, okay, all the best. Seeing Natasha, good night too. And Ron, all the way from Canada, take good care. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Yeah, okay, Ramzan, Adish, take care. All the best. Roger, you too have a good night and be safe. And just by the way, the guy collected that item. So it should be either there or on its way to you guys already. Not a problem. Hopefully the recording will stick and we'll post it as well. Roger, have a good night. Thanks so much for the feedback. Take good care. Okay, Victor, take good care. All the best. Have a good night. Thanks so much. Okay, fantastic, Roger. Nice. Okay, so looking forward to that there. All right, lovely. That is what you call cooking with gas. Yeah, you're certainly welcome. Certainly welcome, yeah. All the best. Take good care.